Hi, everybody. Welcome back to CMN 201. This is for our class for Thursday, the 17th, where we are talking about Psycho. And in fact, in terms of talking about Psycho, you can't really talk about that film without talking about Alfred Hitchcock. The two go together. And when I think about the deification of directors, which we have now with people like Steven Spielberg, can't help but think of Alfred Hitchcock being one of the first to do that. The film is based on a novel by Robert Bloch, and how many times have we talked about this, about these films being based on novels? On the Ed Gein murders, you've probably heard of Ed Gein. There have been other films that have been made about him, including Texas Chainsaw Massacre, that involved cannibalizing women. And definitely this film shows an anger and hatred towards female, among other things. But you can't help but notice the violence against female in this particular film. The hotel itself, the Bates Motel, it's probably one of the most gothic settings that could exist. In fact, this might be the American modern day equivalent of Dracula's castle when we think about the Bates Motel. And the house is as much a character and as much of a monstrosity as any of the other elements within this particular film. We'll see some genre blending, much like we talked about Invasion of the Body Snatchers, blending science fiction and horror. Here we've got a detective story, and since Edgar Allan Poe is credited with creating the first detective story, it seems to be quite appropriate. And Hitchcock, one of the things he was known for doing was making cameos of himself into his film. So I can tell you that about into minute 6 or so of the film, you will be able to see him through a window standing outside wearing a cowboy hat. And I guess you have that privilege of being able to put yourself in your films when you are directing them. It was a rather small budget by Hollywood standards, a commercial success, and a true psychological horror. And I've always seen this film as the psychological horror of an isolated family and domestic seclusion. So I'm getting to the point now where if you have not seen the film, you might want to watch the film now at 2 minutes and 35 seconds. Hi, because now I'm going to be talking about some spoilers here. The negative effects of domestic seclusion, that home is not a refuge, which is the way the suburbs were portrayed and sold. And we saw that in Invasion of the Body Snatchers, definitely there is no safety in the suburbs. And again, we see that with a film like Psycho, that in effect, isolation is not only bad for the individual, this domestic seclusion that occurs, but I would argue that it could also be seen as a geopolitical commentary about what happens with isolationist policies as well. And the television set has become the kind of electronic hearth, replacing the community gatherings that would occur by a campfire, for instance. We definitely will see in this film that there are many secrets behind closed doors. We talked a little bit about this with Cat People and about what's behind the facade of the brownstone. And literally no place is safe, even the shower. So Psycho is probably best known for its iconic shower scene, which you might know of even though you may not necessarily have seen the film. And in fact, it stunned audiences, and it also is a mastery of editing because viewers will swear that they see a knife penetrate the skin during the shower scene, and it never happens. We see images of knife, and we see images of skin, and we see blood, but never do all of them meet together as one. Your mind is filling in the blanks. You can go through this shot by shot if you wanted to. And the reality is that anything that your imagination can conjure up is much worse than seeing a literal horror. I think we've talked a little bit about this with something like Cat People, that so much was suggestive. Um, this film very much upsets expectations. We spend a good amount of film with the main character, who is the thief. We learn to empathize with this main character, this main character is killed, and that's one of the first twists in the film, that this film is not about this main character at all. It happens to be about the hotel or motel keeper, and that's Norman Bates. And that said, Norman Bates, played by Anthony Perkins, at the time he was an up and coming actor. He really wasn't an A-list actor, um, in the way that Vivien Leigh was when she was playing Marion Crane. So again, this would completely upset expectations that you would kill off the major actor in what would appear to be the major characters. And again, we see the idea of female illustrated through some of the symbolism. In fact, birds, note that Marion Crane, Crane is a bird. Bird is slang for female. And at one point, Norman makes a comment to Marion saying that she eats like a bird. Definitely, Norman taxidermies birds beyond creepy. It also is some foreshadowing of how he's going to be not only killing Marion, but ultimately, and there's a big spoiler alert here. So if you're still watching and you don't want to know what happens, stop this right now at 6:20. Okay? So the big twist is that Norman has killed his mother and has basically kept or stuffed her body, much like he stuffs his birds, and he has taken over her persona. So this sense of what we are watching is a kind of voyeurism. We're looking into private moments of characters. Right from the very beginning of the film, when we see that Marion is engaged in an affair, and of course, this would have been quite shocking for the time period. Notice that the first opening scenes were peering into a window. Alfred Hitchcock deliberately shot that in a way that would make us kind of peeping Toms, which is what Norman is as the film progresses, as we see that he's spying on select female hotel guests in order to be able to determine if he's going to murder them, mostly because of his repressed sexuality, because of a domineering mother. Now, TV and film has basically made us all a nation of voyeurs, and it doesn't escape me that watching my class video is also somewhat similar. And Hitchcock wanted to have all those layers. An interesting piece of trivia is John Carpenter, the director you might have heard of Halloween fame, and we will be watching Halloween, was hugely inspired by Psycho. So to truly understand Halloween, you have to understand Psycho. And the lead in Halloween, Jamie Lee Curtis, was the daughter of Vivien Leigh and Tony Curtis. And Vivien Leigh, of course, plays Marion Crane. So how nice is that in terms of putting together some of the most iconic horror films? I also have appreciated some of the dark humor. So at one point, when the mother figure is supposedly being moved into the fruit cellar, she accuses Norman of thinking that she's fruity. And for whatever reason, I find that to be quite humorous. Now, this is a long film. It's an hour and 49 minutes. And I also wanted you to watch some commentary about the film that's approximately 12 minutes long. Now, this commentary is about the uncanny, and if you'll remember, we talked about the uncanny, Freud's theory about that which is familiar yet unfamiliar at the same time, and how disorienting that is. Think about something like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where it turned out that family members looked the same, but yet weren't quite the same. So that would be considered uncanny. And this sense is certainly, I think, illustrated in Psycho. I wanted you to listen to this academic essay after you've seen the film, because watching it beforehand, it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense to get a sense as to some of the talk and scholarship that has occurred around Psycho. And in fact, I can tell you that Psycho is considered to be the first modern horror film. We'll see whether or not you agree or disagree with that. We're still in the black and white era, believe it or not. We won't be moving into the black and white era until we get to the 1970s. But we will certainly see a level of sophistication in terms of cinematography, character development, acting that we haven't seen, I don't think, thus far. And this also allows me, I think, to cheat a little bit. As you know, I've been selecting a film to represent a particular decade. And Psycho came out in 1960, so it should represent some of the tensions of the 60s, which included things like suburbia and included things like fear of other. And that said, also fear of female. And I think all of those are embedded within this film. But the 70s were an incredibly turbulent period, though I wonder which period has not been turbulent. And I'm going to show next week yet another film from, or I'm sorry, the 1960s was a particularly turbulent period, I'm sorry. And again, I wonder what decade has not been a particularly turbulent period. Certainly the 1970s was turbulent as well. So we will see with the film The Exorcist. But considering all of the social movements that were going on and political movements of the 1960s, I've used that as justification for having yet a second film illustrate the 1960s. So if Psycho represents the beginning of the 1960s, I've got a film, Night of the Living Dead, that represents the ending of the 1960s. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Night of the Living Dead. One of the things that we will discuss about this particular film is that a terrible error was made when it was released for production and the copyright sign was omitted, which meant that all of a sudden it became public domain, which meant anybody could show this film anywhere. So this is the one film where you can be guaranteed to be able to find for free online. However, I do caution you as to which version of the film you see. The link that I've included for you, if you're curious about next class's film, you want to see it early, this is in section 4, is a high definition link. So the problem with Night of the Living Dead becoming public access is that there are a lot of poor quality prints that are out there, so you really can't appreciate the cinematography. So if you are going to see a print of Night of the Living Dead, make sure that you're watching the sharpest and the most high definition as possible. In terms of Psycho, the good news is that I was still able to find the link online, which I have included for you, so that you should be able to stream this movie for free. As we progress in the semester, I know it's going to be increasingly difficult as we get closer to contemporary time periods. So I may not always be able to find free links. And certainly if that's the case, I'll let you know. And you can watch the films on reserve in the GCC library or through your own streaming services or other options that you might have for viewing the film. And certainly throughout the course of the semester, if you find links that are better than the links that I've been able to find for free viewings of these films, please share them because that would be very useful for all of us. I'm always anxious that these links will be removed because of copyright violations, but so far so good. So in terms of Psycho, I think what you will find is a very cleverly made film. I think about when the film came out and some of the ways that Alfred Hitchcock was a master in marketing as well as a master in advertising. And one of the things that he did was he came out with promos for Psycho where he talked about that audience members would not be allowed into the theaters after the movie had started. And Hitchcock made agreements with theaters that showed his film that theater owners would not allow late entrance into the film. That just increased the buzz and the hype. What kind of film is this that you can't walk in late to? And of course, a lot of the marketing cautioned viewers who had seen the film not to give away the surprise or the twist ending of Norman Bates really being a kind of personification of his mother, a doppelganger, if you will, because we've talked about doubles so often over the course of the semester. We see this with Marion Crane as well as her sister as well, who are very different kinds of women. And I think also if you consider the kind of audience response to Psycho, I mean, audiences were genuinely scared. So this is a personal story that I can share with you that my mother-in-law saw Psycho in the movie theaters. in 1960. And she was with her husband, my father-in-law. And she was so traumatized by the shower scene, no less, that she was unable to take a shower by herself for quite a while. She would have my father-in-law stand outside the bathroom while she was showering to offer her protection. If you haven't seen the shower scene yet, then you're in for a treat. In terms of the first viewing will never be the same as many of the other viewings. And in this instance, the soundtrack is just as iconic as the film itself. We will see this with more contemporary films when musical scores become more and more important. But as you're watching Psycho, think about the way that female is portrayed. There's some really telling statements there about honeymoon nights and needing to self-medicate that I think are quite telling about the institution of marriage. Think about the idea of psychology, and while the 1960 view of psychology was rather simplistic compared to today, certainly you'll see that in the ending explanation from some of the law enforcement agents. It has a great, I think, understanding of psychosis and of the negative effects of familial seclusion. In fact, I once read an article about how the nuclear family was a complete mistake from a societal perspective, that we really are meant to be in clans and larger groups, and that isolation that has been imposed upon us by the nuclear family has led to a whole host of mental challenges. Certainly, we will see that with somebody like Norman Bates. The idea, too, that the highway has basically redirected traffic so that the Bates Motel is no longer on a thoroughfare. I can't help but think again about the restructuring with suburbia, where centers were that had in the past been quite active were no longer active, and the suburban resettlements were anything but a safe haven and anything but the idealistic version of Americana as they were portrayed to be. Today's attendance question, I thought I would ask you about the shower scene. And this will be due on Saturday, the 19th. Of course, if you need additional time, let me know. And no, you are not required to respond to your classmates, though certainly encouraged to if something moves you. But you are required to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. Why do you think that shower scene is so iconic in Psycho? And keep in mind that these discussion forum responses are based on specific questions that I'm asking you to respond to. These are very different from the journal entries. The journal entries are independent responses that you give to the films that you are watching, and you can certainly incorporate some of the readings and the elements that are discussed in the readings. You can certainly reference previous or future films. I'm not asking for any particular format. Most students submit in about a page or so of writing, but you can submit as much or as little as you like with these journal entries. I'm evaluating the journals for content, not necessarily for grammar or mechanics, and evaluating them informally. So a plus means an excellent. Check plus means very good. A check is satisfactory. There also is a less than satisfactory, a check minus, and an unsatisfactory, which is a minus. And again, that is a major component of the class, your journals, as are the discussion forum responses. The last two components of the class are the final exam, which we will have on the last day of this semester, an essay exam, and you get to choose within the essays, and it's open book, open notes, so it's not an exam in memorization, about how you can sort of synthesize everything we've talked about over the course of the semester. And finally, a final project, something that you do more in-depth work about, more so than you would with a journal. and that final project can be submitted at any point. But if you submitted it at the ending of the semester, that is the last time in which you could submit this project. Obviously, there wouldn't be time to do a revision. There might be time to do a revision if you can get your final project in early enough. It just sort of depends on what my grading load looks like. But I'm certainly happy to look at drafts and to respond. And my suspicion is that your final project will either be a written paper or include some written commentary. So that could be submitted to me via PDF, again, to my email, which is how my grading program works, which is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. Again, that is distinct from the discussion forum responses that you can just post on the discussion forum in Moodle. Or another way of thinking about it, your discussion forum response is something that is read by everybody in the class. Your journal responses are read just by me in the class. So if it turns out that you are missing some journals from previous films, I will still accept those journals. So please submit those in if you haven't already as soon as possible. And I'll leave you with contemplating the idea of the shower scene so that you have an hour and 49 minutes to watch Psycho, plus the 12-minute essay on the uncanny. So next class, we'll put some closure onto Psycho and talk about, in greater depth, why it is that I am selecting two films from the 1960s, our second being Night of the Living Dead. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we'll continue on next week. Take care. Bye-bye.